else, I'd just like to thank Sister Abby for allowing me to speak this evening, and Pastor Jeff. And I know that I feel honored to be able to sit to speak with you. I talked with Abby about 3 weeks ago because the Lord was really moving in my heart with regard to the man Peter. Who knows who Peter is in the Bible? Matthew knows. Amos, who is Peter? He was one of the disciples. And one of the famous things about Peter is that he was the first person who said to Jesus, "You're the Messiah." Jesus said, who do people think I am? And Peter said, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus said, "Hey, upon your confession, I'm going to build my church." Not upon Peter, but upon what Peter said, because Peter knew in his heart who Jesus was. How many people have friends here who they've known for more than 1 year? For more than 2 years? For more than 3 years? Okay. So one of the things about Peter and Jesus was the fact that they knew one another for about 3 years. And during that period of time, Peter and Jesus had quite a few encounters. And one of the things about Peter is that he was very impulsive. Now, impulsive means that he's eager, but sometimes eagerness without thinking. So sometimes he stepped into things that he might not have meant to do. And so I'd like to go over some of those things because he was the way that he was. God already knew that Peter was who he was. Jesus already knew who Peter was. And what is the best part about that is not only did he know who Peter was, but he knows who every one of you are. And so if he had a call on Peter's life, and he did from the very beginning when Jesus stepped in Peter's boat, he has a call on the life that you have as well. So I'd like to just kind of take you through that, because Peter, again, didn't always make the greatest choices, but he had a great insight into who the Lord was. So I have quite a few note cards here, but I'm not sure I'm going to use them all. Okay. Peter met Jesus when Jesus was speaking to the crowd. They were following him around, and he was preaching, and they were closing in on him. And Peter's boat was up against the lake on the beach, and Jesus said, "Would you mind if I stepped into your boat, because these people are crowding me?" And so Peter said, "Okay, yeah, go ahead and step into my boat." So he rowed out a little bit so the crowd wouldn't overcome him. And there Jesus spoke to the crowd. And once the people had left, Jesus said to Peter and his friends, "Hey, did you guys catch anything when you were out fishing?" And they said, "No, we didn't catch anything." "Well, maybe you should go out again, and maybe you should throw your nets on the other one." "No, we already did it. But if you said to do it, Master, we'll do that." So sure enough, they go out, and what happens? We all know that story. They had so many fish, they had to call in another boat. And what was Peter's response when they came back in? Peter said, "You are a holy man, and I am a sinner, and get away from me." So Peter immediately recognized who Jesus was. So that's kind of gives you an idea of what Peter immediately knew about Jesus. He knew that he was somebody that he was going to follow. And not only did Peter decide to follow Jesus when Jesus said, "Come be fishers of men," but so did Peter and James and John.
Yeah.
So a little bit later on in Jesus' ministry, Jesus and his disciples had fed 5,000 people. They were all extremely tired. Jesus said to his disciples, "Go across the Sea of Galilee and I'll be there later." And sure enough, they all started rowing across. And what happened was that almost dawn, the disciples saw something on the water. And they thought it was a ghost, but it wasn't a ghost. And Peter recognized it as Jesus. And immediately, what does Peter do? Remember, Peter is impetuous. Peter says, "Lord," and Jesus says, "Come to me." And Peter gets out of the boat and he starts towards Jesus, and he keeps his eye on Jesus. And the wind comes up. What happens to Peter? He starts to sink. And what did Jesus do? He held his hand out to Peter, and immediately he and Peter get in the boat. Did Peter sink? No. What happened to Peter? He took his eyes off of Jesus. That's what happens to us sometimes. We get so overcome by everything that's around us that we take our eyes off of Jesus. I'd like to tell you about another time that Peter and if you look in the Bible, there are not very many chapters that Peter is not inside. He is very active in the life of Jesus. So Peter and Jesus and James and John and some of the other disciples were sitting down, and Jesus said, "Well, who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And of course, we talked about just earlier, Peter said, "Well, you're the Messiah." Some of the other apostles said, "Oh, you're Elijah, you're Jeremiah, you're someone else, one of the prophets." But Peter knew it was Jesus. Jesus was the Messiah. One thing about that particular experience was that Jesus, at the very same time, predicted that he was going to die. And Peter said, "Hey, never, that's never going to happen." And what did Jesus say? Jesus said, "Get behind me. Get behind me, Satan." Because Peter had a human outlook and Jesus was looking for his Father's outlook. How many times do we, as friends, think we know what's best for someone who is stepping out in faith, and we say, "Oh, no, you shouldn't be doing that," and yet the Lord has already said, "You know what, you need to step out in faith on this." And we get in the way. We get in the way. So this was just one of those times when Jesus said to Peter, "Don't tempt me, get out of the way." Okay, Jesus has his disciples in servant training, because what's coming is that Jesus isn't going to be around. He's going to die for our sins, and he's going to go through a horrible death. But in the meantime, before this happens, he's going to train his disciples not only to be servants to each other, but to others. One of the customs, whenever in Bible times, was that they walked with sandals, and so their feet were always dirty. And so whenever you came into a household, the master of the household would wash your feet. So Jesus decides that he is going to wash the feet of the apostles. Now, there is no account of any of the other apostles having a big deal, but Peter had a big deal. He said, no, Lord, you're not going to do this to my feet. And Jesus said, "Well, Peter, if you don't allow me to do this to your feet, then you have none of me." Well, what does that mean? It means that Peter is not going to be a part of who Jesus is, and a part of the apostles, a part of the disciples. And Peter said, oh, okay, well, if that's it, then wash my head and wash my hands. Jesus said, no, Peter, you missed the whole thing. Is I'm teaching you to be servants. I'm teaching you to love one another. I'm teaching you to minister to one another. And to do that not only to your friends, but to people you don't even know. Okay.
That's good.
So then there's one time after this, Jesus is also predicting his death, and he says to his apostles, I'm going to go someplace where you can't go. I'm going away. And Peter says, okay, then you must be going to prison, and if you are, I'll go with you. And Jesus said, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you like grain. Do you know what that means? It means that you're going to go through some trials. It means you're going to go through some things that you may not want to go through, but that's what's happened. And you know, Peter, so he kind of quiets down a little bit, and then Jesus, Peter says, well, I'll lay my life down for you. And Jesus said, Peter, before the cock crows 3 times this day, you will deny me 3 times. I mean, you will deny me. Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter just, I'm sure, was absolutely wondering what that actually meant. So, sure enough, Jesus took his disciples with him. Just prior to the crucifixion, he took his disciples with him to pray in Gethsemane. And I'd just like to say that whenever you go to pray, maybe you should take some of your friends with you. Maybe if you don't take your friends with you, maybe you should take your friends with you to pray about. Maybe in your heart you have something that you need to pray about for them. Maybe they need to be on your heart. Keep praying for them, because Jesus was praying for them, for the disciples, even whenever the disciples were asleep. He was sweating drops of blood because he was praying for his disciples at that time. When the soldiers came to get Jesus, Peter decided that he was going to protect Jesus, so he cut off the ear of one of the soldiers. And you probably can imagine how Jesus might have felt. I don't know, but he probably went, okay, and just took the ear and put it back on the soldier. And can't you imagine what might have happened if Jesus had not done that? There could have been a big ruckus, could have been a big hoopla, but Jesus took the ear, put it on the soldier. Everything went just like it was supposed to. And Peter still, he's following Jesus. He's following Jesus, and they take him to the high priest's house. And what's happening is that the high priest is telling all of these people about the things that Jesus has done. And Peter, he's waiting outside, and John is inside in where the high priest is and where they're having this discussion. But Peter's outside and he's waiting for Jesus, and one of the girls comes up to him and says, hey, aren't you that guy that's hanging around with Jesus? No, that's not me. That's not me. So then so they move Jesus to a different place, and then what happens? Another girl comes to him and says, hey, you look familiar. I think I've seen you with that Jesus guy. No. That's not me. What happens the third time? Almost everybody knows what happens the third time. The third time comes, and this is really hard for me, because when the cock crows or the rooster crows the third time, can you not imagine the gaze between Peter and Jesus, because they're such good friends. They've spent every single day together for the last 3 years. Here Jesus is probably remembering as this happens, this is the man whose boat I stood in whenever I called the fishers of men. This is the man who called me Messiah the first time. This is the man who heard my Father's voice with me. This is the man who waited with me in the garden. This is the man I love. He's denied me 3 times. Can you not imagine when Peter hears the rooster crow, can you not imagine the gaze that he must have seen coming from Jesus? Do you not know that Jesus' gaze would have been a loving gaze towards Peter? But Peter's probably was of shame. What happened was that whenever the rooster crowed, Peter ran out of the house and he was crying and weeping bitterly. Can you not imagine how he must have felt? Now, let's go forward to the crucifixion. Do you know, remember me saying to you that the Bible, in the whole Bible, or not in the whole Bible, in the Gospels, there's hardly a page that you go by that Peter isn't mentioned. At the crucifixion, where is Peter? It doesn't mention him at all. It mentions John. It mentions some of Jesus' followers at the foot of the cross, and some over at a distance. Maybe perhaps Peter might have been there. But was he there, or was he ashamed? Did he have fear? Can you only imagine putting yourself in Peter's place? Oh my goodness, I have denied this man. He's my friend. I love him so much, and now he's dying, and I'm not going to be able to tell him how much I loved him and how sorry I am. Can you not feel that despair that he must have experienced? So, on the third day, when the women went to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body, what did they find? Almost everyone knows this. Who was there? Nobody except an angel. And an angel told the women, I love this part. The angel told the women, go tell the disciples and Peter, because he wanted Peter to know. God loved Peter. God loved Peter even in the denial that he had of Jesus. He loved him anyway. Don't you imagine that those women ran back to the disciples? Don't you imagine that they probably sprinted? And can you not imagine then the joy and excitement that Peter must have had, that John must have had? They ran to the tomb. It was overwhelming for them. John stopped. He didn't go into the tomb. But that didn't stop Peter. Peter went running into the tomb, and there were the bedclothes of Jesus and the angels sitting there waiting. The angel sitting there waiting to tell Peter, he's gone. But you're going to find him. He's going to be in Galilee. And do you not know what joy must have come to Peter's heart? What joy must have come to his heart? Now here's kind of an interesting thing is, you know, in the 21st century, we already know the end of the story. We already know that Jesus raises from the dead. We already know that Peter goes on to be a mighty warrior for the Lord. On the day of Pentecost, he preaches to 3,000. God blesses Peter to the fact that he is the person who God appoints to tell the Gentiles about Jesus. So Peter, from the very get-go, has been an integral part of the gospel. But here's the most important thing. How do you suppose that Peter knew that Jesus forgave him? Do you remember that just before Jesus went into heaven, he again was on the beach waiting for the disciples. He was there fixing breakfast, and the disciples were out fishing, and they didn't know Jesus was there. And so there they are out fishing, and again, they haven't caught anything. And this man on the beach says, "Hey, have you caught any fish?" "No, haven't caught anything." Then he says, "Throw your nets on the other side." Who immediately recognized who that was? John recognized it, but what happened? Who was it that jumped in the water? It was Peter. Peter jumped in the water, and there he swam. Don't you imagine the bear hug he must have given Jesus at that time? Even though he might have seen him twice before, don't you imagine? Jesus probably got wet because Peter was probably soaking wet. After they had had breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter said, "Of course I love you. Of course I love you." Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." A little bit later, Jesus said, "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, of course I love you, Lord, I love you. Of course." "Tend my sheep." Third time, Jesus says, "Peter, do you love me?" "Lord, I love you. I love you." And then Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." So, how many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times. How many times did Jesus ask Peter if he loved him? 3. Don't you imagine that after that, Jesus knew with all of his heart that Jesus loved him? Even if he had had some kind of qualms before, don't you know at that moment he must have felt this overwhelming love for Jesus? And Jesus telling that to Peter. He didn't say that to James or John. He said that to Peter. So here's the thing I want you to know, is that not only did Jesus say that to Peter, he says that to us. He says, "Joe, feed my lambs. Take care of all those little young people that come on Sunday morning. Tend my lambs. Help in the bus ministry or whatever." He says, "Alon, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. Tend my sheep. Hey, go and help pass out stuff. Go get eyes. Go do all these things. Feed my sheep." Each one of us has no different calling than Peter had. Peter was called to be an apostle for the Lord Jesus Christ, and so are we. Each one of us has a calling. And the most wonderful thing is that when we make mistakes, when we do things that we shouldn't do, we don't have to wait for God to raise from the dead another 3 days. We can tell him, we can ask him right now. We can talk to him right now. We can tell him right now how sorry we are and that we need his forgiveness. I just want to tell you, Temple of Praise congregation, that this place has an opportunity, just like Matt said, to blow the roof from this building. But we all, every one of us, have to be part of that. We all have to be, as Pastor Jeff was talking about, we all have to be leaders. We all have to be Peters. We all have to be fired up. And we have to be taking the word. Every one of us, because every one of us has somebody that we know, a circle of friends that we know, that we preach to. And I just want to thank you this evening. I appreciate your time, Pastor.